Hey everyone, so today I want to compare the GT350 to a 5-liter based Mustang. If you're in the market for an S550 Mustang, whether it's new or used, and you're looking at one of the 5-liter variants of this car, whether it's the base GT, Performance Pack 1, Performance Pack 2, Bullet, or even the Mach 1, this car has probably come across your radar at some point. You've probably wondered, is this car really that much different? Is it worth pursuing? Is it worth looking into? Is this the right car for me? So in this video, I want to compare from a performance standpoint how this 350 and 350R compare to all the 5.0 based Mustangs from the S550 platform. Now, all these cars are based on the same unibody, so the ergonomics, the size of the car, the interior setup are all for the most part going to be the same, the safety system, so I don't want to get into that. This is going to be based all performance based. Engine, drivetrain, brakes, suspension, exhaust, things like that. So basically I'm going to go front to back and compare this car to all those other 5-liter versions. Now, a brief history on this car. This car was manufactured from 2015 until 2020. So if you are looking to potentially purchase one of these, keep in mind it's going to be at least 2 years old. Now, there were two different versions of this car. You had the standard GT350 and you had the more track-oriented GT350R, which is what this car is. Now, even though this car had a 6-year production lifespan, there really were not a lot of options available for this car, and they really did not make a lot of changes. One of the main options for this car was the color combination. Now, you obviously had quite a few different body colors available. Some of them were available every year, like this color. This was race red. This was available 2015 to 2020. And then you had some more rare color options, like grabber blue was, I believe, a 2017 only color. You also had the option for vinyl stripes. Now, almost every color was available with vinyl stripes, and the vinyl stripes were typically available in sometimes 2 or 3 different colors. So you couple the body color with the different options for the vinyl stripes, and you probably had hundreds of different color configurations available for this car for that 6 years. So you can kind of go through the old records and the old history of this car and look at all the different color combinations to kind of tailor what you may exactly be looking for. So that's kind of a basic history of this car. Now let's go ahead and get looking at all the different performance aspects of it, starting with the power plant. Now, by far, one of the most unique aspects of the GT350 was the engine, the 5.2-liter Voodoo V8. This engine was completely different from any of the 5-liter versions of the Mustang. This engine had the flat plane crank in it, which kind of became a buzzword when this car came out. Now, flat plane cranks are nothing new to the automotive industry, but they're pretty exotic for an American car, and especially something like a Mustang. Because of the flat plane crank, this engine revs extremely high. It revs up to 8,250 RPM, which is considerably higher than any of the 5.0 based Mustangs. Now, the characteristics, because of the flat plane crank of this engine, mean it makes medium to high range power. So down low, this engine really doesn't make a lot of low end power. It doesn't have the low end torque hit like a cross plane crank would. So the power builds pretty linear through the rev range, but after about 4,000 RPM, that's where the power really starts to pick up on this car. So it pulls very strong mid to high range power compared to like the 5.0s, which are cross plane crank. They have good low end torque. They have good low to mid range power. They usually pull pretty strong through the rev range, but they don't have the top end like this engine does. Now let's get into the power comparisons. When the 5-liter first came out with the S550 Mustang, it was in the 2nd generation of the 5.0. It made 435 horsepower. Now in 2018, they tweaked it and they went to the 3rd generation of the 5.0. Went to 460 horsepower thanks to some modifications. They had a higher performance version of that 3rd generation 5-liter, which was found in the Bullet and the Mach 1. That went up to 480 horsepower. Now, for 2022, the federal government changed some of the emissions rules, and all the Mustangs actually lost 10 horsepower. So the standard 5-liter 3rd gens went down to 450 horsepower, and the Mach 1 went down to 470. So you lost a little bit of power there. Now, this engine, contrary to popular belief, there is no power difference between GT350s and GT350Rs, despite what people say. And despite from 2015 to 2020, this engine did not see any power increases. All GT350s from 2015 to 2020, on paper, made 526 horsepower. A lot of people say that number is underrated. There have been some pretty definitive stock dyno tests that show that this car probably makes considerably more than that, and that's all I'm going to say. But it makes a solid 526 horsepower. So this is a pretty potent engine, especially for something naturally aspirated. This engine is very strong. Now, there were two different versions of this engine, no power differences. You're going to hear this and see this a lot on the forums. The Gen 1 and Gen 2 Voodoo engines. Gen 1 was considered about 2015 to 2018. Gen 2 was 19 and 20. The main difference was Ford tweaked the internals of this engine. They beefed up the rotating assembly. They also did a lot of small things like the bearings. They changed the ring packs out. If you go on the internet, you're gonna see a lot of horror stories about people blowing up the engines in these cars. Now, if you read between the lines and do a lot of thorough research, I think that was thoroughly overblown, because it came down to you really needed to understand what this engine was about. This being a production race engine, you can't treat this the same way you treat a regular car engine, or even maybe something like a 5.0 based Mustang. The early cars especially consumed a lot of oil, and that was an acceptable level of oil consumption. If the engine ate a quart of oil every 500 miles, that was normal. In a lot of regular cars, that would not be considered normal. In this car, especially early on, it was. So if you were not doing your due diligence and opening the hood and checking the oil regularly, and you're going 2, 3, 4,000 miles and not checking your oil, and that thing's down 4, 5, 6 quarts of oil in a car that holds 10 quarts, and you're running that baby up to 8,000 RPMs, you're gonna throw a rod, you're gonna spin a bearing or have a problem. So that was what a lot of the complaints about this car were. Now, not all of them were related to low oil consumption. There was a bunch of issues. Some of them had really extensive oil consumption, and the engines got replaced from there. For 19 and 20, they beefed up the internals. The oil consumption thing kind of went away with the new ring packs. There were some issues because of a flawed production where they weren't deploying the secondary cam tensioners, and the engines were jumping time, and basically the pistons were hitting the valves and blowing the motors. That wasn't really the car's fault. That was from flawed production from Ford's end. So, but basically don't overread into it. There's plenty of issues with the 5.0 engines as well. Overall, they're a very solid engine. A 5-liter Mustang is a great engine. I don't want to bash that car at all. That is a fantastic car. But don't overread into the issues about this car. Overall, it's a solid engine, but you just need to understand that it does require a little bit more attention than your regular car engine will. And you kind of need to just kind of keep an eye on things, make sure it's being maintained, and especially make sure that it is not running low on oil, especially if you're driving the car hard, since this engine is designed for primarily not only street but also track use. So now let's go ahead and take a look at the transmission in this car. Now, the transmission is very unique to this car. This car, throughout the entire production run, only had one transmission, the Tremec 3160 6-speed manual. This has been widely regarded as one of the best manual transmissions ever built. It's durable, it's well built, and it's not notchy. And this transmission has very few, really if at all, any issues. Contrary to most of the manual transmissions from the 5-liter base Mustangs, the base GTs, the performance pack cars, and the Bullets all had the Getrag MT82, which was the complete opposite. That transmission was plagued with problems. It had a lot of major issues. They tried to address them, they made upgrades, but there were class action lawsuits regarding that transmission, and it was basically, unfortunately, it was kind of nothing but problems, that transmission. Even a lot of owners will agree on that. The only other 5-liter Mustang that got this transmission was the 21 and newer Mach 1. This transmission was so good, Ford decided to stick it in the Mach 1 once they ended the production of this car. So that's one thing to keep in mind if you're looking at a manual transmission car. Again, this car was only available in manual, and if you're looking at a manual, the Mach 1 manual 3160 from this car is something that you should seriously consider because it is that good. Now, since we're in here and you can't see it, let's talk about the rear ends. This car, all the 350s, had a 373 rear end with a Torsen differential. Now, most of the 5-liter base Mustangs, you could get the Torsen differential. The performance pack cars, the Bullets, the Mach 1s, you could all get that Torsen limited slip mechanical rear differential. I believe only the base GTs, they would have a clutch style differential in them, which was a little bit different. So you could get that really nice Torsen with a lot of the other 5.0s. That you could get. So that was good. That's a pretty durable differential. But another aspect of the rear end that sets this car off is the differential cooler. That was an Achilles heel to the Mustangs if you were tracking these cars. Almost every 350 had a differential cooler. The only ones that didn't were the early base 350s that did not have the track pack in them. That was something that was a problem, where if the guys were tracking the 350s with no diff coolers, or really any Mustang without a diff cooler, you were probably going to overheat the rear end. In 2017, they made the track pack standard equipment, so they're all going to have the diff cooler, and all the 350Rs have diff coolers as well. The only Mustang 5.0s, I believe, have the diff cooler are the Mach 1. So the performance pack cars, the Bullets, they don't have that. So if you're going to street drive the car, you're going to be fine. You should not have an issue. But if you're going to track drive it, keep that in mind. You need to have a diff cooler because overheats are common for non-diff cooled track-driven S550 Mustangs. Now, the exhaust system was unique to the GT350s. They all had an active valve exhaust with 2 modes, normal and sport. Now, you could cycle between those 2 modes in the car by either a toggle switch by the shifter to just change the exhaust mode itself, or on the steering wheel, if you change the drive mode, that would cycle between the different exhaust modes depending on which drive mode you were in. And this car, at about half throttle or so, the valves automatically open up and it gets louder. Now, the exhaust system difference between the 350s and the 350Rs is the Rs have a factory resonator delete. The standard 350s do have the resonator from the factory, but that is a very popular option to get rid of that so it matches this car. Now, the 5-liter Mustangs, the Mach 1s and the Bullets come standard with the active valve exhaust. They have more modes. They have like a quiet mode in them as well, which can be really convenient for certain situations. And when the GTs, like the performance pack cars, the active valve exhaust is an option. It's kind of expensive. It's about a $1,000 option. My take on it is, if you're not going to modify the exhaust, I would get that. It's really nice to have to be able to cycle between a really loud mode and a very quiet mode. That can be convenient for certain situations. If you're going to throw a full exhaust system on the car, don't even bother getting it. Save the money to put it towards whatever custom system you want to do. Now, this also has the exhaust tips built into the bumper, basically to act as a heat shield between the plastic of the bumper itself. So that's what makes the exhaust kind of unique with this car. Now, I know if I don't do an exhaust clip, I'm going to get yelled at, so I'll link above an exhaust comparison I did with the valves both open and closed from a couple of years ago. And finally, suspension, brakes, and wheels for the GT350 compared to the 5.0s. Now, with the suspension on the standard Mustang GT, it was just your standard non-adjustable suspension. Same thing with the performance pack ones. Now, with those cars, there was an option for the MagneRide suspension. I believe it's a $1,600 option. It's basically an electronically controlled suspension. You can control it inside through either a toggle switch like the exhaust, or you can cycle through the drive modes on the steering wheel. Now, my understanding is that system does not like to be messed with at all. It's kind of hard to customize and tweak, so it's one of those things where if you don't plan on modifying your suspension system, it's a nice thing to have, to be able to just instantly change the suspension setup of the car. If you're going to change your suspension, your coilovers and everything, you're probably better off not getting it and saving that money to whatever custom setup you want to do. Now, if you're getting Bullet or Mach 1, I believe that MagneRide dampers are standard. Now, almost every 350 has the MagneRides. All the Rs have them, and almost every standard 350 has the MagneRides. After 2017, the track pack became standard, and that was part of it. It was also part of the electronics package. So if you had either the electronics or the track pack on the 16s or the 15 GT350s, you would have the MagneRides. You'd have to have none of those options to have just a standard suspension setup. So virtually every 350 you're going to come across is going to have the MagneRide dampeners. Now, the brakes. This is what kind of sets this car above the 5.0s. The standard Mustang GT has a 2-piston floating caliper, a good set of brakes, very capable, a good street brake that should be perfectly adequate. If you go to a performance pack car, the Bullet or the Mach 1, on the front you get a 15-inch single-piece cast iron rotor with a Brembo 6-piston caliper, a very capable set of front brakes. Can definitely handle pretty much anything you're going to throw at it on the street, and it's definitely going to be up to some track use as well. They kind of cut the corners on the back brakes on those cars, though. They use a single piston floating caliper with the integrated parking brake, so it's not a bad setup, but they kind of cut the corner a little bit with the rears on those cars. With this car, you're kind of going to the next level. You're going to a 15.5-inch rotor. Now, it's only half an inch diameter difference, which might not sound like a lot, but you're picking up a lot of thermal capacity with that half-inch diameter difference in the rotor. and you're getting an aluminum hat, which does two things. It reduces your rotating mass because it's aluminum, and the aluminum is going to dissipate heat much better than cast iron will. So these brakes are definitely next level on this car, and they didn't cut the corners on the rears. You're also getting a 15-inch rotor on the rear with that large aluminum hat that's going to dissipate heat very well, and a Brembo 4-piston caliper. So from what I understand, even the people that heavily track these cars, it's almost impossible to fade these brakes. You're never going to fade these brakes out on the street. And as long as you're running pads and fluid that are capable of track work, these brakes are extremely capable for extended times on the track. Now, one thing you'll notice between 350s and 350Rs is there's a different caliper color. That is a color difference. There is no actual performance or mechanical difference. All the 350s have the exact same brake setup. So, and then finally, the wheels and tires. Now, obviously, with wheels and tires being such a popular option, there's lots of different wheels and tire configurations. Almost every Mustang has some sort of alloy wheel, except for this car. This is the only car that featured the carbon fiber wheels from the factory, a very, very expensive setup. They're very light, but they are pricey, and a lot of people will not street drive these wheels because they are so expensive. Now, the tires, just like with the wheels, lots of different configurations. Real briefly, on something like a Performance Pack 1, you're going to get an alloy wheel. I believe the tire setup are 255 fronts, 275 rear, so that's a pretty respectable tire size. If you want like a Performance Pack 2, you're going what is known as a square setup, which is 305s all around with a Cup 2 tire, a very capable tire setup on that car. And then the bullets, I think, are pretty similar to the Performance Pack 1 cars. I'm not sure off the top of my head the size of the tires on those cars, but like with the Mach 1, if you went with the handling package, you get the exact same tire setup on this car that you get on the handling package Mach 1s. The 350s, you get they're all 19-inch wheels. You get 295s on the front, 305s in the back with the 350Rs, 305s, 315s. All the 350Rs have Cup 2s. And then after 19, I believe, on the standard 350s, they started running Cup 2s on them. The early cars did not have the Cup 2s. Cup 2s are nice. They're really sticky, but they wear down kind of quick, and they throw rocks everywhere. So just keep that in mind. But a lot of people change out wheels and tires, so that's something that's easy enough to customize yourself. So now I just kind of want to go over my final thoughts of comparing this car to your standard 5.0. So final thoughts, GT350 versus 5.0 Mustang. Now, one thing to keep in mind, like I said before, they discontinued the 350s in 2020. So it's 2022 right now, so these are going to be at least 2 years old if you want to pick one of these up. They also discontinued the Performance Pack 2s and the Bullets in 2020. The new 5.0s that are available right now are base GTs, Performance Pack 1s, and Mach 1s. So just keep that in mind. Now, my opinion, if you're looking for something a little bit more unique, maybe you want a track car, either whether heavy track use, light track use, something maybe to use on the weekend, something a little bit more unique, I think that this is a better way to go. If you're looking for a car, maybe more daily use, something you want to commute with, maybe you want an automatic transmission, I think the 5.0 might be a little bit better to go. You have a little bit better low-end power on those cars for daily driving use, whether you're in traffic or not. So I think that's a little bit better suited as a daily driven car. The engine's not nearly as high strung in those cars as it is in these things. So I think the standard 5.0 may be a little bit of the better option. And you can get it new. You can customize it exactly how you want it compared to this car. But for me, I don't drive this car all the time. This is basically just like a weekend warrior for me. I don't track the car, but I just enjoy driving around on the weekends. I'll run errands in this car, spirited drives, things like that. That's what I like about using this car for. So it's not expensive to maintain or operate this car with insurance, using it on the weekends like that. So that's how I like this car. And if I was looking at a Mustang for a daily driver, I'd probably get like a Performance Pack 1. It's not going to cost anywhere near what these things are going to cost, because these things have gone up significantly in value over the last year or so. Since they discontinued them, a lot of people have run out and bought them, versus a new Mustang. The prices on cars are still a bit high now, but you can get that for probably considerably cheaper than this car, and you can get it new, you can get an extended warranty, and it's probably going to be a little bit less to maintain if you're driving it a lot and racking up the miles on it. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and in the very near future, there's going to be a GT500 next to this GT350R. So hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.